Welcome back for another deep dive. This time we're going to be tackling
a big one.
Yeah, Jerusalem and Mecca.
Yeah, some really fascinating stuff.
Yeah.
Places you've probably heard of.
Oh, yeah, absolutely. And you probably have some ideas about these cities.
Especially
if you're familiar with Islam.
Oh, yeah.
But we're going to be looking at them a little differently.
Yeah, through a different lens.
Yeah, lens that kind of challenges some of those traditional narratives that are out there.
Exactly. So we're going to be using the Quran itself.
Okay.
Using the Quran, but alongside historical and geographical analysis. So we can really explore some alternative interpretations.
Sounds good. So the main source we're going to be using for this deep dive is a book called The Trench or the Walls of the City.
Ooh, very interesting.
Yeah, by Dr. Khaled Waleed.
Okay.
And he takes a very interesting approach.
Yeah, he does.
To some traditional Islamic narratives.
Yeah.
He's not afraid to stir the pot a little bit.
He really isn't.
So I'm excited to dig in and see what he has to say.
Me too.
So one of the first things that he tackles is this idea of the secure city.
Okay.
Now, you see that in the Quran. Mm-hmm. And a lot of people...
And most people, when they think of the secure city, they
think...
They're Mecca.
Mecca.
Right.
Yeah. But Dr. Waleed says...
He proposes something else.
He says, no, not Mecca.
It's Jerusalem.
Specifically, a place called Baca, Jerusalem.
Baca, Jerusalem. Now,
right? What is that?
So traditionally, Baca is understood as like this valley near Mecca.
Okay.
But Dr. Waleed is arguing that that understanding may have come later.
Okay.
It might not have been the original understanding.
Gotcha.
He points to several verses in the Quran that, according to his reading, clearly refer to Jerusalem as the secure city. Okay. Like verse 14.35, where Abraham prays for Baca, Jerusalem to be made like a sanctuary.
A sanctuary.
Well, safe place.
Okay, so why is that important?
Well, this is really interesting because in Islamic tradition, Abraham is connected to Mecca.
Right.
He's believed to have built the Kaaba, which is the holiest site in Islam.
Which is in Mecca.
Yeah. So if Abraham is praying for Jerusalem to be made the sanctuary, that kind of throws a wrench in the whole thing.
Yeah.
Right.
Like, why is he praying for Jerusalem to be a sanctuary if Mecca is supposed to be the central location?
Yeah.
Okay. So that's one.
That's one verse.
He also brings up verse 95.3 and 90.1 through 3, which mention the secure city.
Okay.
But they don't explicitly say Mecca.
Right.
And Dr. Waleed is arguing that based on the context of these verses, they're talking about Jerusalem. Not Mecca.
Not Mecca. And he provides his own translations of these verses to support these claims.
Interesting.
Yeah.
So he's really going back to like the...
He's like looking at the text and piecing together like a puzzle to create this different picture of early Islamic history.
Yeah. Okay, I like that.
Right.
That makes sense.
Okay, so then this brings us to the Forbidden Village.
Okay.
So
Forbidden Village.
In verse 27.91, the Quran talks about a forbidden village where the prophet is commanded to worship. Okay. And traditionally, this is understood to be Mecca.
Mecca.
But Dr. Waleed's like...
He's like, no. Hold on.
He proposes a different location.
Different location. Okay.
And this is where it gets even more interesting.
Okay, I'm ready.
He suggests that this forbidden village is actually Mecca Petra.
Mecca Petra.
An ancient city.
I don't even know that one.
It's in present-day Jordan. Yeah.
Okay.
And you might be thinking, well, why Mecca Petra?
Yeah, why?
Well, this city has a very long and rich history.
Okay.
And it was a significant center for the Nabateans, which were an ancient Arab people.
Okay.
And this is where Dr. Waleed connects Petra to the Israelites. Okay. So he highlights historical links between the Nabateans and the Israelites. Okay. Suggesting that Petra may have played a role in the narratives that are presented in the Quran. Okay. So it's fascinating because it brings in this whole other layer of historical and geographical context. Yeah. And then this connection to Petra leads him to his analysis of the Battle of the Trench. Okay. Which is a really pivotal event in Islamic history. Right. So the Battle of the Trench, also known as the Battle of Azab, is traditionally understood to have taken place near Medina. Right. And the story goes that the Prophet Muhammad and his followers dug a trench around Medina to defend themselves against this much larger enemy force. Right. And it's seen as like a miraculous victory for the Muslims. Yeah. But Dr. Waleed,
He's like...
Yeah, he's not buying it.
He's like, hold up.
He says that the traditional understanding doesn't match the Quranic description of the battle.
Oh, really?
He points to verse 33.9, which describes enemies attacking from above and below.
Above and below?
And he interprets this as a description of an attack on a fortified city with walls and tunnels.
Oh.
Suggesting that the trench was actually the defensive structures of Jerusalem.
Oh, so not even a trench.
Not a literal trench.
Just like the defenses of the city.
Yeah, like the walls and the tunnels.
Yep.
So he's basically saying that this entire battle took place in Jerusalem, not Medina.
In Jerusalem. Wow. That's
a pretty radical reinterpretation.
Yeah.
And it ties directly into his argument about Jerusalem's central role.
Oh, I see.
In early Islamic history.
Okay.
And then this leads him to probably his most controversial claim.
Okay.
The rejection of Mecca as a sacred site.
Whoa.
Yeah.
Okay.
He doesn't just question Mecca's significance.
Right.
He argues that the shift in Qibla...
No, remind me what Qibla is.
Qibla is the direction Muslims face when they pray.
Okay.
So traditionally, the Qibla was Jerusalem.
Okay.
But it was later changed to Mecca. And Dr. Waleed suggests that this shift was more about consolidating power and unifying the early Muslim community under this new Arabian-centric identity.
So not necessarily divine inspiration.
Not necessarily. More like a political move.
Interesting.
Yeah. And he goes on to suggest that the well of Zamzam, which is a sacred well in Mecca, is not the same well mentioned in the story of Hagar and Ishmael in the Quran.
Okay.
He argues that the well in the Quran is actually in Beersheba, a city south of Palestine.
Okay.
And he refers to verses 4.82 and 18.27, which emphasize that the Quran is consistent, that it's unchanging, like God's word is eternal. So he's basically saying that if the Quran is truly the word of God and God's words are eternal, then the traditional narrative which emphasizes Mecca contradicts the Quran.
Okay.
It's very interesting.
Yeah, that's a bold statement.
It is. But he doesn't stop there.
Okay.
He also looks at the economic and political implications of his claims.
All right.
He briefly mentions the wealth generated by the Hajj, which is the pilgrimage to Mecca, suggesting that this financial power may have played a role in the shift of the Qibla and the establishment of Mecca as like the central Islamic site.
Okay. Where did some of these pivotal events actually take place?
You know, it's really interesting because in this deep dive, we're not just going to rehash those like typical stories. We're going to be using things like the Quran, the Bible, even archaeological findings to like really challenge where these events happen.
Yeah. I mean, that's what makes this so interesting, right? We're going to be asking some pretty like thought-provoking questions like, did Abraham actually go to the Arabian desert? Or could that first house of worship in the Quran actually be talking about Jerusalem and not Mecca? It's pretty controversial stuff, so buckle up. So I guess a good place to start would be with this term, this Becca, right? It's in Quran 3.96, and it says that the first house of worship was built there. Usually people think Becca means Mecca, but our sources today are saying, well, maybe not.
Right. So they highlight this valley of Baca thing. It's actually in the Bible, Psalm 84.6. And this valley, a lot of people connect it to Jerusalem. And it's this symbol of hardship turning into blessing, but through faith, you know? So they're saying maybe Becca could mean Jerusalem too, connecting this whole transformation through faith thing back to like the very start of Islam.
So we're talking about like reinterpreting, I mean, a really basic Islamic idea.
Yeah.
And saying maybe it's about Jerusalem, not Mecca. That's a big deal. What else, what other evidence is there to back that up?
Well, they really dig deep into these other verses in the Quran. Like some of them talk about a secure city, some say this city.
Yeah.
And they're saying that this stuff is probably about Jerusalem, especially because of its walls, you know, those big fortified walls. Like historically, that matches up with Jerusalem way better than Mecca.
It sounds like they're being really careful with the words in the Quran. Like maybe some verses were misunderstood or even like, I don't know, changed on purpose over time.
Exactly. And this leads to, well, this other argument they make, one that goes right against a huge story in Islamic history, the trench story. You know that one.
Oh, yeah, the Battle of the Trench.
Sure.
Muslims defending Medina, they dig this trench. I remember learning about it, how important it was strategically.
Right. But our sources, well, they're claiming that whole trench story is made up.
Well, hold on. Made up. Like they're saying the Battle of the Trench, that whole thing never happened.
Yeah. They're saying it was invented to make people think Medina was more important, to kind of pull attention away from Jerusalem as the real holy site.
Wow. That's a big claim. So, like, they're saying this story, this really famous story, is totally fake.
Yeah. And they're saying, look, Jerusalem had these huge walls, like real protection, not just some trench in the desert. They're saying the trench story, well, it just doesn't line up with real history.
So this source is saying that this trench story, a story that's like super important to how people understand Islam, it's just made up. That's huge. They're really questioning if things happen the way we've always been told.
Exactly. And it's not just about the trench. They also question, well, the story of Abraham's journey and where that Zamzam well is.
Now, this is where it gets really interesting. This is like the foundation of Islam, these stories. How are they saying those stories are wrong?
Okay, so they're saying the way Muslims traditionally understand that journey with Abraham, Sarah, Hagar, and Ishmael, and where that Zamzam well is, it's wrong. They say it actually happened in southern Palestine at a place called Beer Lahai Roi, not in the Arabian desert like we usually think.
Wait, so they're saying that all happened somewhere completely different?
Yeah. And they're saying, look, the Bible puts it in southern Palestine, not the desert. And this difference in location, that's a big deal. They're saying it means those events probably didn't happen in Mecca.
And it's not just the Bible, right? They also bring in modern researchers, like Dan Gibson. He's done a lot of work on early Islamic geography. And Patricia Crone and Tom Holland, too. What are they saying?
So these researchers, they come from different fields, but they all kind of agree. The evidence just doesn't really back up Mecca being the original holy city. Their findings, they really support this different version of history that our source is talking about.
Okay, so we've got these Quran verses, we've got the Bible, we've got these modern researchers, and, oh yeah, they also talk about these ancient coins that were found.
Right.
What about those?
So they found these old Persian dinars and Roman dirhams, like ancient coins. They found them in Jerusalem and Petra. And our source is saying, well, that's more proof. These places were probably more important in early Islam than we think. And get this, they even connect these coins to verses in the Quran that talk about these types of money. It's like more evidence that these places mattered.
Wow, okay. So we've got the Quran verses, we've got what the Bible says, we've got these modern researchers, and now these ancient coins. Sounds like they're really building a strong case for this different perspective.
They are.
So after all of that, what's their final conclusion? What do they say after looking at all this evidence?
They basically say that all the evidence points away from Mecca and towards Jerusalem. They're saying we really need to take a fresh look at how we understand early Islam.
So we went from questioning where the first house of worship was to, potentially rewriting some major Islamic history. That's a pretty big change.
It is. And it makes us think, what would that mean? If we change how we see these events, what does it mean for how we understand Islam today? What about the millions of people who follow Islam? Those are big, big questions.
No kidding. And that's what makes this deep dive so, so gripping. We're not just talking about facts. We're talking about the very foundation of a major world religion.
Exactly. And, whenever we get into stuff like this, stuff that's complicated and maybe even sensitive, it's important to remember there are always different points of view. This source makes a strong argument, but there are definitely other ways of looking at this.
Right. It's not about picking sides. It's about really understanding the evidence, understanding the different perspectives, and then coming to our own conclusions.
Yeah, exactly. This deep dive, it's an invitation to think critically, to question what we think we know, and to be open to new interpretations. That's where the real learning happens, And, this whole thing makes you think, like, it's not just about where these places are, right? It's about how powerful stories are, how history can be, like, shaped and reshaped over time.
Yeah, you're totally right. We're seeing how, changing how we understand history can really challenge, really deeply held beliefs. And that makes you wonder, why was the traditional narrative created in the first place?
Exactly. And the source brings up this really interesting point about the Abbasid Caliphate. They're the ones who decided to change the Qibla, the direction of prayer, from Jerusalem to Mecca. They're saying that was a huge turning point with, consequences that we're still seeing today. Okay,
so for those of us who don't know, what exactly is the Qibla? And why was this change such a big deal?
So the Qibla is the direction Muslims face when they pray, their daily prayers. It's a super important part of Islam. And originally it was towards Jerusalem, but then the Abbasid Caliphate, they were this powerful empire from the 8th to the 13th century. They decided to change it to Mecca.
So the direction that millions of Muslims face every day when they pray was changed by this political power centuries ago. That's wild. What does the source say about why they did that?
Well, they're suggesting that maybe it was about money and power, like political power. Think about Mecca today, right? It's incredibly wealthy, and a lot of that comes from being the holiest city in Islam because of all the pilgrims who go there.
Wow.
And then he brings up something else.
What's that?
The discovery of Persian dinars and Roman dirhams in Jerusalem and Petra. And he uses this to support his argument about the historical importance of these cities. And he links this to verses 12.20 and 3.75, which mention these types of currency.
So we see that Dr. Waleed is presenting a very complex, multi-layered argument.
Multi-layered.
Yeah, and he's using textual analysis, historical context,
geographical insights,
and even economic considerations.
It's absolutely that traditional understanding of Islamic history.
It's very interesting.
Yeah, it is.
And while his arguments are...
They definitely have their critics.
Right. They offer a different perspective.
A thought-provoking one.
Yeah, one that makes you think.
For sure.
And maybe question some things that we...
Things that we think we know.
Yeah, that we think we know about.
Yeah, about early Islamic history. Really makes you wonder.
And what is the real story?
Exactly.
What happened?
Yeah, and how much of what we think we know
is actually true.
Is based on solid evidence.
Versus,
interpretation.
Yeah, later interpretations and political motivations and things like that.
It's a really interesting question.
Yeah, very interesting.
And that's what we're going to keep digging into.
Yeah, this is a good one.
This is a good one, for sure.
I'm excited to see where this goes.
Me too.
So
let's keep going.
Let's keep going.
Let's see what else Dr. Waleed has to say.
Right, let's do it.
Dr. Waleed's arguments really challenge traditional views.
Yeah, they do.
So,
what does this even mean?
Yeah, what are the implications of this work? What does it mean to question such deeply ingrained narratives, especially, in a religious context?
Right, for many people, these narratives are fundamental to their faith.
Absolutely.
And their identity.
Their whole understanding of the world.
Yeah, so to question those can feel really
unsettling.
Yeah,
even threatening.
Yeah.
And it's important to approach these discussions with sensitivity.
Absolutely.
With respect.
Yeah, I think that's super important.
But it's also crucial to remember that questioning and critical thinking aren't incompatible with faith. In fact, they can be really powerful tools for deepening our understanding and strengthening our convictions.
Yeah, you're right. Engaging with different viewpoints allows us to test our assumptions.
Exactly.
Refine our understanding and ultimately gain a more informed
and nuanced
perspective.
Yeah, it's like holding up a familiar painting to a different light source.
Okay.
Right?
Wow.
You might see details and brushstrokes that you never noticed before.
I like that.
And it just enriches your appreciation of the artwork.
Yeah, that's a great analogy.
Thanks.
So, not everyone's going to welcome these challenges with open arms.
Oh, yeah, of course not.
Some might see Dr. Waleed's work as an attack on their faith.
Absolutely.
Or even heresy.
Yeah, and that's understandable.
Yeah.
But I think it's important to remember that diversity of thought exists within any religious tradition.
Right.
So what might seem radical to some
could resonate with others.
Exactly.
It's all about perspective.
Perspective and interpretation.
Yeah.
And that's where open dialogue and respectful debate
becomes so important.
Become crucial.
Yeah.
It's about creating spaces where different viewpoints can be expressed and explored without judgment, without condemnation.
Yeah. I think that's a really good point.
Yeah, and Dr. Waleed's work, regardless of whether we agree with his conclusions, it sparks that dialogue.
It does.
He's encouraging us to think critically, to engage with the Quran and Islamic history on a deeper level, and to be open to possibilities beyond the traditional narrative.
So I think that's one of the values of his work, regardless of whether
other people agree with him or not.
Whether you agree with his conclusions or not.
Yeah.
It's the fact that he's making people think.
Yeah.
And he's prompting this discussion and this exploration, which is so important.
Yeah, for sure.
It really makes you think. If the whole story about how important Mecca is was maybe changed for political and economic reasons, what does that mean for how we understand history?
Right. That's a huge question. And the source is really pushing us to think critically about how stories are made and how they can be used for different agendas. They want us to look beyond the surface, to think about the hidden reasons behind the stories we're told.
And it's not just about Islamic history, right? This applies to all kinds of historical narratives. We should always be asking who benefits from this story being told this way, whose voices are being heard and whose are being silenced.
Exactly. This deep dive, it's like a reminder to be careful about what we believe, to question what we think we know, and to try to see things from different perspectives. It's about understanding that history isn't like this fixed truth. It's always being interpreted and reinterpreted.
It's like trying to put together a puzzle and then realizing that some of the pieces might be missing or in the wrong place or even from a completely different puzzle.
Yeah, that's a perfect analogy. And the source we're looking at today, it's giving us some new pieces to try to fit in. Even if you don't agree with everything they're saying, just thinking about these ideas, looking at the evidence and considering different perspectives, that's what's really valuable.
It's about expanding our understanding, realizing that there might be more to the story than we thought. And sometimes questioning what we think we know can lead to some really amazing discoveries. So, what do you think is the most important thing we've learned from this deep dive so far?
I think it's the focus on critical thinking and doing your own research. The source is basically saying, don't just take my word for it. Go out there, investigate, and figure things out for yourself. And that's a really powerful message that goes way beyond just this topic.
Yeah, I completely agree. This deep dive is an invitation to dig deeper, to challenge what we think we know, and to try to understand history, faith, and the stories that shape our world in a more nuanced and informed way. You know, it's amazing. This deep dive has really taken us on a wild ride. We started talking about these different locations, and now we're like questioning the whole idea of how history is told and how much power these narratives have.
It really shows you how everything's connected. History, faith, how we interpret things. When you start questioning one little thing, it's like this whole web of ideas and beliefs starts to like unravel.
Yeah, and I think that's why this deep dive has been so, I don't know, so mind-blowing. We're having to rethink what we thought we knew about a major world religion, and it's making us look at history in a whole new way.
Absolutely. It reminds us that history isn't this like set in stone thing. It's constantly changing, depending on who's telling the story and how they're interpreting it.
And as we've seen, like those interpretations can be shaped by so many things. Politics, money, social stuff, religion. It makes you realize like how important it is to think about the context when we're trying to understand history.
Yeah, for sure. And that's one of the biggest takeaways from this deep dive, I think. It's not about blindly believing one story or another. It's about learning how to think critically, how to evaluate different perspectives, weigh the evidence, and then form our own conclusions.
So for our listeners, you know, some of them might be feeling a little overwhelmed with all this. What's the one piece of advice you'd give them as they try to make sense of these complex ideas?
I'd say don't be afraid of the uncertainty. It's okay to have questions, you know, it's okay to wrestle with stuff that doesn't seem to fit together. It's okay to not have all the answers. Like, that's where the real learning happens, in that space of questioning and exploring.
That's such a good point. Being curious, thinking critically, those are the keys, not just for understanding history, but for understanding the whole world around us.
Exactly. So if this deep dive got you thinking, don't stop here. Keep researching, keep asking questions, and talk to people who see things differently. Have those conversations, even if they're tough.
Couldn't have said it better myself. And remember, every deep dive is a journey, right?
Right.
We may not always find the answers we're looking for, but the search itself can be really rewarding.
And who knows, maybe those unanswered questions will lead to even more exciting discoveries down the road.
Well said. So on that note, we're going to wrap up this deep dive into the, well, sometimes controversial world of early Islamic history. But remember, the conversation doesn't end here. Keep those curious minds engaged, keep exploring, keep asking those thought-provoking questions. Thanks for joining us on this journey, and we'll see you next time for another fascinating exploration.